October 22nd, 1944. Far out over the western Pacific, east of Formosa, the sky looked calm enough to lie. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka eased his A6M Model 52 into a cautious climb, the engine vibrating through the airframe like a tired heartbeat. Salt crusted his goggles. His hands remembered every movement, even as his mind carried too many ghosts. Behind him flew what remained of blue section. 3 zeros. That was all. 4 days earlier, there had been 11. The radio hissed and snapped with half-formed words, overlapping call signs, a warning that never finished, a sharp inhale that turned into nothing. Tanaka swallowed. He had been flying since 1938. China, the early victories. The days when the zero ruled the sky and American pilots ran. He had survived carrier decks slick with oil, friends burned alive over Rabaul. The slow realization at Guadalcanal that the war had changed its face. But this was different. This wasn't defeat in combat. This was erasure. Over the past months, pilots weren't dying in fights that could be studied or remembered. They were vanishing. Entire flights simply ceased to exist. No wreckage spotted. No parachutes. No final transmissions. One moment they were on the scope, the next they were gone, like someone had reached up and switched them off. Combat logs told the same impossible story again and again. Contact with American fighters. Immediate silence. No survivors. No lessons. By late 1944, squadron commanders were flying blind, sending young men into the sky without knowing what hunted them. The enemy fighter had a name, the Grumman F6F. But no shape in Japanese intelligence reports, no clear tactics, no weaknesses, because the pilots who faced it did not return. This wasn't how air war was supposed to work. Even disaster usually spoke. Defeats produced data, mistakes, insight paid for in blood. But now, blood bought nothing. The first hints had appeared months earlier, during clashes over the Central Pacific. A 4-plane patrol would be redirected toward an American formation. Excited voices over the radio confirmed visual contact. Then the channel went dead. Hours later, if fate was generous, a single zero might stagger home, riddled with holes, its pilot shaking, describing speed he couldn't match, firepower that never stopped, an enemy that struck once and did not let go. These fragments were all that remained of entire units. Unknown to the men climbing into the sky, American fighter doctrine had shifted with cold precision. Hellcat pilots were trained not just to win, but to annihilate, to seal the sky behind them, to hunt until no enemy aircraft could escape and carry a warning back. By early 1944, Commander Kenji Morita, a sharp mind within naval aviation planning, understood the danger. In a restricted report sent to Fleet Headquarters, he warned of a growing intelligence void, a war being fought without eyes. The enemy, he wrote, was not just destroying aircraft, they were destroying information. And as Tanaka leveled off beneath the sun, scanning empty air where his wingmen should have been, he felt the weight of it settle into his chest. The sky had learned how to keep secrets, and in the next part, those secrets would begin to surface, not through Japanese eyes, but through the American doctrine designed to make sure no one ever came back to tell the story. By the time fleet analysts tried to make sense of the numbers, the pattern was already fatal. Fighter units sent against American carrier groups were being erased at a rate that defied precedent. 8 out of 10 pilots did not return. Of the few who did, most were bleeding, burned, or mentally shattered, incapable of explaining what had happened above the clouds. Commanders demanded answers. Instead, they received silence wrapped in statistics. What Captain Ryoichi Nakamura, an experienced aviation planner, could not clearly express in his reports was that the Americans were no longer fighting battles. They were executing a system. The Hellcat was not merely outperforming Japanese aircraft. It was functioning as the core of a doctrine engineered to leave no witnesses. To understand why Japanese pilots stopped reporting encounters, one had to look backward, to the quiet revolution unfolding inside American carrier air groups a year earlier. In 1942, the U.S. Navy had entered the war flying the Grumman F6F Wildcat, a rugged machine that could absorb punishment but could not match the Zero's climb, turn, or grace. Early encounters were brutal lessons. American pilots learned quickly that attempting to outturn a Zero was a death sentence. Survival demanded something new. Out of that desperation came a defensive idea, born not from dominance but from necessity. Two fighters linked together, watching each other's tail, weaving through the sky in coordinated arcs. When one was attacked, he fled toward his partner, dragging the enemy into gunfire. It worked just well enough to keep men alive, but it did not win control of the air. It was a shield, not a spear. Everything changed in mid-1943 when the first Hellcats rolled onto carrier decks. On paper, it was simply better, faster, stronger, able to climb, dive, and recover with power the Zero could not match. But the true transformation did not happen in the aircraft factory. It happened in briefing rooms. American tacticians realized they were no longer forced to react. For the first time, they could dictate the fight. The old defensive patterns were stripped away. In their place emerged an aggressive doctrine built around speed, altitude, and mutual destruction of the enemy. Hellcat formations positioned themselves above Japanese patrols, waiting. When contact was made, they struck as a single mass, diving through the formation at crushing speed, firing short, lethal bursts, then climbing back into safety before the enemy could even turn. But that was only the opening move. The real danger came next. Hellcat pilots did not scatter. They did not chase glory. They stayed connected. If a Japanese pilot tried to pursue a climbing Hellcat, another American fighter slid into his blind spot. If he broke away, diving toward the sea, he was followed. Always followed. The Americans had absorbed a single, ruthless principle into their training, repeated until it became instinct. Do not allow escape. Do not break contact. Do not let the enemy live long enough to learn. Every maneuver, every formation turn, every pursuit was shaped by this belief. Hellcat squadrons were not hunting aircraft, they were hunting certainty. And as Japanese pilots realized too late that disengagement was no longer possible, that even retreat was fatal, the skies over the Pacific became a place where information itself was being killed. In the next part, we will see how this doctrine collided with Japan's dwindling pilot pipeline, and why even courage and experience could no longer bridge the widening gap between those who learned from combat and those who never came back to speak at all. The contrast was invisible to the men climbing into their cockpits, but it defined who lived and who vanished. Over Europe, American Army fighter pilots were taught restraint. Stay close to the bombers. Break off long pursuits. Do not chase an enemy beyond the edge of protection. Survival there meant discipline. Over the Pacific, Navy pilots learned the opposite lesson. There were no friendly lines over open ocean. No ground units to retreat toward. Every enemy aircraft that escaped was an aircraft that would rise again tomorrow, carrying experience, warning, and memory. So the rule was simple, and it was unforgiving. Finish the fight. The Hellcat made that rule possible. Its range reshaped the battlefield. With external tanks, F6F patrols could loiter for hours, long after fuel gauges in Japanese cockpits began to sink toward empty. By 1944, American carrier groups had woven the sky into layers of control, patrol boxes overlapping like a net drawn tight. A Japanese pilot who survived the first clash often flew straight into the next. There was no clean withdrawal, no safe corridor home. Somewhere above or ahead, another Hellcat was already turning toward him. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a young squadron leader whose combat diary survived the war, wrote that by late summer of 1944, retreat itself had become dangerous for the enemy. They no longer escaped battles. They escaped moments. This reality was acknowledged openly among American pilots. Commander William Carter, later celebrated as an ace, explained after the war that his unit assumed any Japanese fighter entering engagement range was already lost. Not damaged, not repelled, eliminated. That assumption shaped everything. Hellcat formations were no longer flat. They were vertical. Fighters operated at staggered altitudes, sometimes 2 layers, sometimes 3, separated by thousands of feet. The highest layer watched and waited. Their job was not to fight first, but to kill last. If a Zero pilot attempted to disengage from the lower formation, he climbed straight into gunfire from above. If he turned downward, he descended into a pursuit corridor where speed bled away and American engines kept pulling. The sky became a sealed volume, a space with no exit. Japanese pilots soon learned that maneuvering skill no longer mattered once the trap closed. Every choice led to another set of guns. The only escape left was desperation. Dive to the wave tops, push the engine beyond limits, run. But even this gamble failed more often than not. At ultra-low altitude, damaged or lightly built Japanese aircraft struggled to maintain speed. Hellcats did not. Their airframes held together under punishment that would have torn other fighters apart. Their engines delivered power even when salt spray blurred the canopy and the ocean rushed past only feet below. Pursuit stretched on until one aircraft ran out of fuel, and more often than not, it was not the American. Those few Japanese pilots who survived long enough to understand what had happened faced another shock. The Americans were no longer guessing where to shoot. Hellcat pilots had mastered deflection fire with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. 6 heavy machine guns poured thousands of rounds per minute into converging arcs, guided by gyroscopic gun sights that calculated lead automatically. To Japanese aviators trained to aim by instinct and experience, American hits felt impossible. Bullets struck where no gun appeared to be pointing. Aircraft disintegrated in a single pass. Survivors later spoke of being fired upon from angles that defied logic. What they did not know was that by 1944, American pilots were fighting with mathematics embedded in their sights. And as this mechanical advantage merged with relentless doctrine, the final consequence became unavoidable. Japanese pilots were not just being defeated. They were being removed from the cycle of learning itself. At first, the Zero still danced. A skilled pilot could roll into a turn, slip past 3 or 4 streams of tracer fire, feel the old confidence rise for a heartbeat, and then die to a shot that should not have existed. Hellcat rounds arrived from angles that defied instinct, striking during turns that once guaranteed safety. Japanese pilots began to understand, too late, that agility no longer broke pursuit. The Grumman stayed with them. It stayed fast. It stayed lethal. Against the Wildcat, a Zero pilot could reverse a fight, force the American wide, reclaim control of the sky. Against the Hellcat, that certainty evaporated. Speed kept the American guns aligned. Firepower meant even brief exposure shredded wings, fuel lines, pilots. And when Japanese rounds did hit, the Hellcat often kept flying, scarred but intact, while the Zero burned. In the few surviving combat reports, pilots described the experience with a single recurring word: trapped. Once contact was made, there was no disengagement that did not lead to death. To fight meant facing an enemy that could not be outturned. To flee meant being hunted. Some hoped the American would make a mistake. Some prayed he would run out of ammunition. Neither happened. By 1944, Hellcat pilots were trained to fire patiently, conservatively, their belts heavy with rounds, their doctrine built on certainty rather than desperation. Every second of survival for the Japanese pilot was borrowed time. This reality shattered more than aircraft. It shattered the foundation of Japanese naval warfare. Modern combat depends on return. Pilots return with stories, errors, observations. Commanders adapt. Tactics evolve. But when pilots stopped coming back, the system broke. By the summer of 1944, the intelligence blackout had reached the strategic level. Japanese naval aviation, rebuilt after the disasters of 1942, existed largely on paper. The fleet had carriers again. It had aircraft. It even had pilots. What it did not have was experience. Training pipelines had been gutted by urgency. Programs once measured in years were compressed into months. Young men arrived on carrier decks with barely 100 flight hours, knowing how to take off, land, fire, and navigate, but knowing nothing of survival against a modern enemy. The men they replaced had been masters before the war began. Veterans of China, trained endlessly in formation discipline and combat maneuvering. Those men were gone. Their knowledge died with them in burning wrecks scattered across the Pacific. The new pilots were sent into battle carrying manuals written for a different war. Doctrine still praised the Zero's turning circle. Instructors still spoke of drawing American fighters into spirals of maneuver. Advice that once won battles now guaranteed annihilation. Senior commanders knew their pilots were green. What they did not understand was how outdated their information had become. Vice Admiral Shiro Takahashi, tasked with leading the carrier force into decisive battle, later admitted that he possessed almost no reliable data on current American fighter tactics. Reports were fragmentary. Survivors too few. Intelligence months, sometimes years, behind reality. And so, on the morning of June 19, 1944, as Japanese reconnaissance aircraft finally sighted the American carrier force west of the Mariana Islands, the die was already cast. Doctrine promised reach. Range promised surprise. Takahashi believed his longer-legged aircraft could strike safely beyond American retaliation. At 8:30 a.m., he ordered the first strike wave launched. Hundreds of young pilots climbed into the sky carrying faith instead of knowledge, flying toward an enemy they did not understand, defended by Hellcats that would ensure most of them would never return to explain what went wrong. In the next part, the illusion of range and initiative would collapse in a single day of slaughter, remembered by history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 67 aircraft lifted into the morning sky, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes bound together by doctrine that assumed the enemy would be surprised. They were already doomed. Long before the Japanese formation reached visual range, American radar screens bloomed with contacts more than 100 miles out. Inside carrier combat information centers, voices stayed calm, hands moved with rehearsed precision, and Hellcat patrols were quietly redirected like pieces on a board. By the time the Japanese aircraft crossed the 40-mile mark, the trap had closed. Over 70 F6Fs were already above them, unseen, holding altitude, waiting. When the first Hellcats rolled over and dove, the sky broke apart. They struck from 5,000 feet above, tearing through the formation in clean, disciplined passes. Young Japanese pilots reacted exactly as they had been taught. They turned toward the attackers, trying to force a maneuvering fight that no longer existed. The Hellcats did not turn. They fired once, sometimes twice, then vanished upward, climbing faster than pursuit could follow. Zeros that tried to chase bled speed and altitude until American guns cut them apart. Those that ignored the fighters and pushed forward toward the carriers ran straight into another wall of Hellcats waiting below. The airspace had depth now. No direction led to safety. Within half an hour, the formation had ceased to function. Aircraft burned, spiraled, or simply fell away. The survivors scattered westward, damaged, disoriented, hunted. Hellcat sections stayed with them for miles, firing until fuel limits forced disengagement. Only a fraction reached their carriers, and even then many missed decks, crashed short, or slipped beneath the sea with empty tanks. On the flagship, reports arrived stripped of meaning. The strike had not been repelled. It had been erased. Pilots spoke of enemies appearing above and below at the same time, of fighters that could not be shaken, of an attack that felt endless. To them, it seemed as though the Americans possessed infinite numbers. In reality, they had possessed coordination. Faced with incomprehensible losses and no usable intelligence, the commander made the fatal decision that revealed how blind the fleet had become. He ordered another strike, this time larger. Over 100 aircraft launched, The greatest concentration Japan had managed since the early war. They flew into the same sky, defended by the same system. Radar saw them coming. Hellcats rose to meet them. What followed was not a battle so much as repetition. The formations disintegrated under diving attacks. Dogfights never formed. Escape routes closed. American pilots later said it felt less like combat and more like execution, aircraft appearing in their sights faster than they could fire. Japanese pilots fought alone, separated, overwhelmed by coordinated sections that moved with terrifying discipline. Those who ran were chased. Those who turned were cut down. By afternoon, additional waves met identical fates. When the sun began to fall on June 19th, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were gone, and with them the last illusion that the Imperial Navy still possessed a functional carrier air arm. American losses were minimal, many caused not by enemy fire but by the chaos of friendly anti-aircraft bursts as raids overlapped. The imbalance was so extreme that it defied belief even among the victors. For Japan, the disaster was more than numerical. It was terminal. The pilots who might have learned, adapted, and returned never did. And in the next part, we will see how this single day ensured that Japanese carrier aviation would never recover, turning the Pacific sky into a one-sided domain ruled by Hellcats and silence. The numbers were so lopsided that even the victors struggled to believe them. Hellcat squadrons lost fewer than a handful of aircraft in direct fighter combat, while Japanese losses climbed into the hundreds, an exchange ratio so extreme it bordered on the unreal. When American pilots trapped their aircraft onto pitching carrier decks that evening, laughter echoed through ready rooms. Someone joked that it had felt like shooting targets tied to strings. The phrase spread quickly, half in disbelief, half in bravado, and by nightfall the day already had a name that would live in naval lore. For Japan, the same hours carried a different weight entirely. This was not simply defeat, it was exposure. The surviving pilots who staggered back to their carriers tried to explain what they had faced and found words inadequate. They spoke of enemy fighters that arrived from above and below, of attacks that never stopped, of formations erased before anyone could even understand what was happening. To exhausted ears, it sounded exaggerated, almost delusional. As the fleet withdrew westward under cover of darkness, having lost the majority of its air groups in a single day, the commander confronted something more dangerous than destroyed aircraft. His pilots were broken, not physically but spiritually. Reports described men shaking, crying openly, refusing to believe survival was possible in another encounter. One officer later recalled a young aviator whispering that they had been armed with spears and sent against steel. The intelligence blackout that had concealed the truth before the battle now poisoned the aftermath. Staff officers, unable to reconcile tradition with catastrophe, questioned the credibility of the survivors. Surely no enemy could be that dominant. Surely discipline had failed. Surely courage had faltered. What the Imperial Navy could not fully accept was that courage no longer mattered. By mid-1944, the equation had shifted beyond individual skill. American fighters combined superior technology, radar-directed interception, layered formations, and a doctrine obsessed with annihilation. Against that system, Japanese fighter combat was no longer competitive. It was terminal. As summer turned to autumn, the pattern repeated across the Pacific. Intercept missions ended in destruction so reliably that seasoned commanders began treating them as sacrificial by design. The language of operational orders changed. Early reports still spoke of tactics and improvement. Later ones abandoned illusion. Missions were assigned with the quiet understanding that no one would return. The words expected loss appeared. Then inevitable loss. Then simply certain death. One veteran pilot, Lieutenant Haruto Miyazaki, who survived repeated encounters during the defense of the Philippines, kept a small notebook hidden in his flight gear. In late October 1944, he recorded a briefing where the squadron leader spoke without ceremony, stating that tomorrow's mission was not meant to be survived. Their purpose was delay, nothing more. Miyazaki flew the mission. Out of 12 aircraft, 2 came back. That night, his final line contained no emotion at all. He wrote only that reality had unfolded exactly as promised. And as the Pacific sky filled with more American carriers and more Hellcats, the Imperial Navy entered its final phase of air warfare, one where survival itself became the exception, and the silence after takeoff grew heavier than fear. They had been beaten long before the engines cooled. The Americans hunted until fuel gauges forced restraint, not mercy. Lieutenant Masao Fujimori survived his final interception only because his Zero was so torn apart that the Hellcats pursuing him judged the ocean would finish the job. They turned away in search of targets that still flew straight. Fujimori barely made landfall, his aircraft collapsing on impact, his body alive by chance rather than design. What he carried back held no value. His debrief added nothing new. The enemy was faster, heavier, better armed, organized in ways that left no openings. Knowing this changed nothing because there was nothing left to change. Japan could not build fighters fast enough. It could not train pilots long enough. The curriculum had been cut until young men were taught how to take off and how to die, with little in between. Tactical innovation required skill, coordination, practice under fire. None of those could exist when pilots were rushed through training and sent directly into annihilation. By late 1944, American carrier groups operated off the Philippines as if unchallenged airspace were a given. Hellcats flew patrols and escorts with such dominance that Japanese interceptions became rare events. Brief flashes of resistance extinguished almost immediately. Some American pilots began to worry privately that the absence of real opposition would dull their edge. One letter home, written without triumph, noted that combat had become routine. The enemy appeared, was destroyed, and vanished. It felt wrong, not dangerous, wrong. The last phase of the blackout arrived with the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By then, conventional air power no longer existed in meaningful form. Suicide operations were no longer desperation. They were policy. Young pilots were selected, given just enough instruction to fly toward a bearing, and launched with no expectation of return. When they encountered Hellcat patrols, they had no tools to fight back. Only hope, stretched thin over miles of ocean. Hellcat squadrons refined interception into procedure. Engage far from the fleet. 50 miles. 75 if possible. Kill everything before it came close enough to matter. Some Japanese pilots, allowed a final night to write, acknowledged openly that they expected to die long before reaching their targets. They wrote farewells without tactics, without illusion. American combat reports from Okinawa tell their own story. Early war entries spoke of danger. Mid-war entries spoke of effort. Late war entries read like inventories. Targets destroyed, ammunition used, time elapsed. One April report noted the elimination of a 16-plane suicide formation in 11 minutes, adding calmly that the enemy aircraft showed no evasive response and appeared flown by novices. By that stage, Japanese commanders no longer sought intelligence on American fighters. There was nothing to learn. Superiority was absolute. Missions were planned with the assumption that no pilots would return. The only remaining question was whether any damage could be inflicted before annihilation. Admiral Kenta Sakamoto, overseeing final air operations, recorded in his journal that he no longer read after-action reports. They contained no decisions, only confirmations. The Hellcat had not merely won the air war, it had ended it. The sky, once contested, had become a closed system. And in that system, Japanese pilots did not gather information, did not adapt, did not return. They simply disappeared, leaving behind silence where knowledge should have been.